So here's an intentionally provocative intro. When I was in middle school, one of the speakers for chapel was doing a talk on Peter. I went to private Christian school, hence the weekly chapel. And in this talk, must have been one of Peter's shining moments, the pastor reached the conclusion and said to a room full of middle school students, "So tell me, who wants to be a Peter?" We're here to study the Bible. We're here to study the Bible. We're here to study the Bible. Might get us in trouble, 'cause we're being intentionally provocative with our intros. So admittedly, that's a bit of lowbrow humor for a church Bible study, but as a middle schooler, those sorts of things stick with you. In this video, we're going to be talking about John chapter 18. We've sort of turned a corner away from the farewell discourse of Jesus, which has occupied most of John 14 through 17. Climaxing with that high priestly prayer or the farewell prayer in John chapter 17. And now we've started to turn the corner towards the passion narratives. There was a New Testament scholar named Martin Kaler who said of the Gospel of Mark that Mark was basically a passion narrative, a story that was intending to retell the death and resurrection of Jesus with an extended introduction. And you really could make that claim of any of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, that the main point of the author is to get to this moment, the moment when Jesus is crucified and the vindication of Jesus in his resurrection. That's the point of the Gospels, and we've had in John 17 chapters leading up to this moment, and now things are beginning to unfold. Now, as I mentioned, this study doesn't have a whole lot of controversy to it, which is fine. Not everyone does. But there's a couple of things that are worth mentioning here as the betrayal of Jesus begins to unfold. First, the author of John is giving us what I would refer to as shaped history. When you compare this story to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are noticeable differences in how Jesus is portrayed, and how Judas is portrayed, and how this whole event is portrayed. It's attempting to give us a theological history by instilling and reaffirming some massive points. Some commentators want to begin by framing this episode in a garden. This is not the case in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Some people would say that because it's in a garden, it gives us echoes back to Genesis. You could even make that case because in John chapter 1, remember it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That in the beginning, it's a Genesis term, so it takes us back to the book of Genesis, and this tie here is Jesus being the better Adam, the one who withstands the temptation, the one who lives up to his end of the bargain. Now, if that's the case, that's the only Adam typology in the entire book. So some commentators want to say, well, let's pump the brakes there, but it's at least laying under the surface. Now, the real differences in this story compared to the Synoptic Gospels are the portrayal of Jesus. In John, Jesus is in complete control. In the Synoptics, remember, this is the betrayal of Jesus is right after the episode in Gethsemane where Jesus is praying and languishing in his prayer to the Father. Take this cup from me. If there's any other way to do this, let's do that. In the Gospel of Luke, it says that he's sweating blood. He is an anxious, worried mess. In the Gospel of John, he's in complete and utter control. When Judas shows up with this detachment of soldiers, this potentially 200 to 600 group of Roman soldiers and the temple police from the Jewish religious leaders of the time, Jesus is the one who is in control here and sort of dictating what happens, which is not the case in the other Gospels. Judas does not betray Jesus with a kiss. In fact, Jesus is the one that's asking the questions of this group. Whom are you looking for? He says. And in fact, when they respond to that, they say Jesus of Nazareth, and then we launch into this sort of theological underpinning of this entire story and of John's entire retelling of the gospel. Jesus replies, in the NRSV it says, "I am he," which is a fair translation of the Greek, although the Greek is more literally "I am." It's ego eimi in the Greek. And for any ancient reader, what they would have heard was not just this declaration that Jesus is the person that they're looking for, that Jesus is the Jesus of Nazareth that they're wanting to be identified. Jesus is making a divine claim of himself, because this is the same wording that's used of God in Exodus chapter 3 in the burning bush, when Moses says, "Who am I supposed to tell the people this crazy message that I have? Who am I supposed to tell them that has sent me?" And God responds, "I am who I am." So throughout the Gospel of John, when Jesus makes these "I am" statements, they're theologically loaded. And here it's no different. Jesus says, "I am." In fact, it says that when he says this, the entire contingent of officers and temple police and maybe even Judas himself, they step back and they fall to the ground. It's weird because then everything just sort of replays and Jesus says, "Whom are you looking for?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." And then he says, "I told you that I am he." It's really strange. So commentators are sort of trying to figure out, like, okay, so did they really fall down? Is this a theological wordplay where they're, giving obeisance to Jesus? They're bowing down. Maybe they're worshiping in the story world here. What's happening? This is just really strange. But we do have the author of the Gospel of John making these underlying divine claims of Jesus in this story. So it's shaped history. There's differences in who Jesus is. There's differences in who Judas is. I did note that Judas does not betray Jesus with a kiss here. I also failed to mention that Judas does not take any money in the Gospel of John. We don't know that side of the story from John's portrayal. And then finally, when this is happening, it says that Peter, he takes out his sword, he draws it, and he strikes the high priest's slave and cuts off his right ear. Now this we get from other Gospels. In John, though, it names the slave. It says the slave's name was Malchus. And some commentators have noted that whenever names are given to people, in the Gospel of John in particular, they eventually become followers of Jesus. You might think of Nicodemus here from John chapter 3. Remember, these stories were written decades after the events that they are recalling happened. So they're written in a different context, and the inclusion of Malchus's name could be a sort of tip of the cap to the reading audience, saying, like, this is where Malchus came from. He was the guy that got his ear chopped off, and now he's here with us. It's sort of speculative, but there is some basis for that, because some of the characters that are named end up showing their stripes towards the end of the story, like Nicodemus as a follower of Jesus. We see how that sort of unfolds in the story itself. This is also noteworthy as well, because Jesus says to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" Again, this play against the Synoptic Gospels, where Jesus is sort of struggling with this whole identity. If you can take the cup, take it, because I don't want it. This is pretty tough. If there's any other way, let's do it. I'll do what you want me to. And in John, Jesus is like, it's my time. It's the hour. I'm in control. Don't I have to do this, Peter? Put your sword away. Also, you could pull sort of the hippie liberal, but also theologically astute observation that Jesus is calling us to active nonviolence here. He's making some bold statements, and will make even more bold statements in the chapters to follow, but he's doing so by submitting to these governing authorities and resisting in a nonviolent manner. And I think that that's at least worthy of our consideration here in this passage as well. So we've started to turn the corner, and we're beginning to see how this is starting to unfold. As chapter 18 continues to unravel, we'll see Jesus in his trial before the Jewish high priest and also before Pilate. But here, as we begin to frame this, remember, shaped history. Notable differences between Judas in John and Judas in the Synoptics. Noticeable differences between Jesus in John and Jesus in the Synoptics. Most notably, Jesus is the divine. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is making claims for himself that he doesn't make of himself in the Gospels, but here in the Synoptic Gospels, but he is here in the book of John. And also this underlying note of active resistance and nonviolence. So there's a lot of things in this passage to think about. We'll throw it up on the screen behind you and encourage you to hang out with it for a bit and see how it speaks to you.